we'll start anyway. My name is Stan Miller. I'm the board president of the Midwest. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Is it okay? My name is Stan Miller. I'm the board president of the Midwest High-Speed Rail Association, and we'd like to welcome everyone to our annual meeting. A preliminary measure, we'd like to thank some of our constituencies in business, some of our sponsors, the Norb Brake Company, Infrastructure Engineering, Mott Macdonald, Talgo, Hanson Engineering, and Freeman Seating Company. In order to get a network of high-speed rail in the Midwest, we obviously need other constituencies, including government, and we have some elected officials who will be here today. I don't know that they're all here right now, but I'd like to give you some of their names. Cook County Commissioner Garcia, Congressman Mike Quigley, Alderman Pawar, State Representative Michelle Mussman, State Representative Elaine Nickritz, and Mayor Rogers from the village of Dalton. Another constituency is labor, but I think the most important constituency is everybody in this room. So give yourself a big hand because I think we're all on the right. Lastly, I'd like to thank some of our board members who are here, including Madeline Shepard from the Metropolitan Planning Commission, Maurice Ball from Fermi Lab. Are you here, Maurice? Yes. Okay, there you are. Keith Kalinowski from the Quebec Trade Delegation. And I'm Stan Miller. I'm an attorney with Nixon Peabody in Chicago. I'd like to give special thanks to Claude Lusada, who's sitting in the back. And Claude was the founder of this organization, and we owe, I think everybody in this room owes him a tremendous debt, so if we can give Claude a hand. My last thank you is to someone who probably doesn't get thanked enough, but does an incredible job for organization, and that's Dylan Hayward, who's the project manager, who's sitting right there, and he puts this thing together. Next, I'd like to introduce you to our executive director, Rick Harnish, and I'll say no more.
Madeline Shepard. There we are. I didn't hear your name when Stan was listing board members, so we might make sure our newest board member is Madeline Shepard. You were the first one? I apologize. I'm the executive director, Rick Harnish. I've been the executive director since 2001, and I was at the table when Claude, back in 1993, said, as we were sitting around a table, probably about 30 of us, and Claude said, you know, we're going to have some expenses. We're going to need a newsletter. We're going to have some other expenses. Why doesn't everybody put their hand in their pocket and put $25 out on the table? And that's the official start, is that day, and I remember that day very well. So Claude, thank you very much for getting it started. Nikolai Shosbo is also one of the co-founders at that time, and unfortunately he couldn't make it. So is that first presentation? No? Okay. So it's been a very interesting several weeks over the past several weeks. I think you will all agree that we're living in very interesting times right now. It's been interesting to what do you do when the president one week says to airline executives and airport executives in a very public meeting, he says, you know what, I want high-speed trains, right? And then the very next week, he puts the brick on Caltrain electrification, which is a part of doing high-speed rail in California. How do you react to those two different things? Or then what do you do with, during his State of the Union, which isn't the State of the Union the first year, but his big address to Congress, he says, we're going to build new modern railways. and then he proposes zeroing out all funding for investing in railroad infrastructure. It's very challenging, and how do you deal with that? And we've been wrestling with that over the last several weeks. But through it, we have to remember why. Why are we here? Why did we all get together, and why is this worth doing? And in one of these meetings about talking about our messaging and talking about, I'm really excited, one of the things we're doing right now is working on a new website. One of the guys at the table said, have you ever been to Madison, Indiana, which is this tiny little town on the Ohio River? And he starts talking on and on and on about his trips to Madison, Indiana, and how he loves it. And then Ryan, who is here and is helping us with the website, said, have you ever been to Columbus, Indiana? That is a fascinating town. In fact, that's where his parents met. But the owner of Cummings was concerned about the quality of the city. So he paid, whenever a building was proposed to go up, he paid for a world-class architect to design that building. So Columbus now, which is about 60 miles south of Indianapolis, is this mecca for architects to go and visit, right? So we have this really cool stuff. Yeah, Michigan and Kalamazoo and their program to make sure that anyone who graduates from high school gets to go to college. Madison with the college that's there. Stuff in Iowa. We've got all this great stuff. And we're very productive still. We've still got very innovative businesses. The capital of knee replacements is in Warsaw, Indiana. All of this works together better if you can come and talk to each other face to face. And that's why we're here, because we're helping it be possible for people to see each other more often face to face and actually do that stuff that works better face to face. So we could have done this meeting on a conference call, a big webinar, right? But it doesn't work as well, and that's why we all traveled here today. So there are 6 things we need to work on. I'll talk more about this in the afternoon. And our program, we have a specific task we are working on, and all 6 things you need to have high-speed rail actually occur. But the most important thing is we need to focus on the appropriators, because the people with money are the people who make it happen. And in the Midwest, so there's the Appropriations Committee in the House and the Senate, and then there's the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development subcommittees of those committees in the House and Senate. In the House, there's 3 members of the THUD committee in the Midwest, and it's a very small committee, and it's the most important committee for us. And one of them represents Creston, Iowa. The other represents his constituents would either drive to Erie, Pennsylvania or Cleveland to catch a train. And then the third is Mike Quigley, and he actually represents our office area. So you'll be hearing a lot more in the next several weeks about what we're doing with approaching the appropriators. Are we ready or? No. Okay, I'm sorry, Mark? Okay. So we're going to have, in trying to bring all of this complicated things with the 6 people and the Appropriations Committee and all of this, we've been working on what we have been calling the phased network model, which is a market-based approach. And I'll go over that. It's been a really big process. We've got a first draft ready to share with people who are willing to look at first drafts and make comments. We'll have that ready out in the next week. And then all of our messaging will flow around this document that we're doing. It's about 40 pages long. And I will do a brief overview of it at the end of the program today. Mark, are you ready?
Yeah.
Or, I'm sorry? Yes? Okay.
Tim can go.
Oh, Tim can go. Okay. So for the last transition, if there's any questions you would like to ask me now as we fill in the next couple of minutes. Yes, sir.
Big question is appropriations. Our state has tied up with no budget.
So when you say our state, you mean Illinois?
Yeah.
And for those who are not from Illinois, the Speaker of the House and the governor are in a war to the death. And we are the blades of grass that are suffering from the war of elephants. So we haven't had a budget in this state for 2 years. And there are a lot of people saying that perhaps we won't for another 2 years. And so it's difficult to think about big things and think about how you make investments happen under that scenario. The thing is, when it breaks, it will break quick. And when there is a budget, that budget will happen quickly, and you're only in the game if you're prepared in advance. And so you have to be in it now, even though it seems frustrating, and talking about what we need. And the thing we need most for all of these trains, whether it's Metra with its 50, 60-year-old coaches that it's running and 20 to 30-year-old locomotives, or it's the sleeper trains and the 20-year-old sleepers on the superliners that really need to be replaced with higher performance equipment. The highest priority in all of this is rolling stock, and we'll be keeping very focused on how in each of these appropriations do we get rolling stock out of it. Are any more questions? No? Okay, are you, where are we at? You ready?
Yeah, we're going to do a little change.
Okay. Mark Walbrun is with Mott Macdonald. The firm recently changed its name. He has been a member and supporter of ours for many years and has helped us over the years more clearly define the steps that need to be taken to get to high-speed rail. So thank you, Mark, for coming up.
Thank you. If you check your program, it says Tim Hefner's talking. I know Tim Hefner, but I'm not Tim Hefner. He's working on getting his situation with the computer standardized. Anyway, thank you so much for your time and everybody getting here early on a Saturday morning. And I just wanted to share some information that I gleaned over many, many years working in the transportation field. And this is, by the way, the reason you can trust this information is this goes exactly counter to what I do. I am a civil engineer, railroad engineering by training. I build stations and platforms and tracks and access to facilities and all kinds of infrastructure. So I'm telling you on this presentation not to fund me. So, do I just push it or?
You should just click to the right.
Oh, to the right. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, since this will be interesting. I'm going to have to do it from the floor. I just have to read how to do it. There are a lot of attributes towards a good passenger rail system. And one of the things that is often overlooked, the first one is span of service. How early do you start? How late do you end when you're going between cities? Frequency that we're going to talk about today is the number of one-way trips that is between two locations on that particular corridor. There are two other measures we use that sometimes appear in print and sometimes are kind of flip-flop, but they have specific meaning in our business. Punctuality is whether or not you're going to arrive on time. Now, a lot of things affect that, some of which are not the railroad's fault, other ones are. And we tend to divide things by that. When we have other traffic, slow orders, unusual movements, that's pretty much the railroad's problem. Passenger delays are oftentimes accompanied by delays in departing or arriving or excess time. Those are ones that are pretty much limited. Railroad has some impact on them, but not for the most part. And then there's ones that are absolutely not anything to do with the railroad. Grade crossings, police actions, weather, things like that. Reliability, on the other hand, is whether or not the train operates or not. Otherwise, you get infinite on the delay, which kind of messes up the statistics. The most common, rolling stock shortage. Problem with the train, cars, locomotive. Staff shortage. Somebody didn't show up when they were supposed to. The backup didn't show up, or they just ran out of people. Or in the case of severe impacts, the line is closed. A tree fell across and nobody could get it off, whatever. So we're going to talk about what impacts frequency has across the world. I'm going to look at 7 examples around the world and 6 here in the US and get you comfortable with some numbers. Now, I'm going to summarize these at the end, so you don't have to write them down or anything, but it'll give you an idea of how common our corridors are relative to other ones in the United States. London to Paris, 265 miles, driving time about 6 hours. That includes putting your car on the train and taking it off on the other end and driving. Rail travel, obviously going straight through, 2 hours and 20 minutes. So a huge advantage for rail travel over driving. Average train speed 115. Service hours, notice 15 hours. They start at 5:40 in the morning and the last train departs at 8:30 in the evening. So a fairly long span of service. They do 15 trips. Therefore, they're doing 1 trip an hour, essentially. And there has been well-documented experience looking at how frequency impacts people's judgments to use a transportation service. And in general, what the statisticians have come up with, along with the human factors folks, is that people tend to add about half of the difference in frequency. So if you have a 1 hour difference, the train leaves at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m., but you wanted to leave at 8:30 because you can't get there for the 8 a.m. train. So you're going to get there at 8:30. You kind of wish the train would leave at 8:30, but it doesn't leave until 9. So you tend to add half hour to the overall running time because it doesn't get you at the other end when you want to. It gets you there a half hour later. So the half frequency add is common in the industry. You add that to the running time of 2 hours and 20 minutes, and the perceived travel time is 2 hours and 50 minutes. The last number is an interesting one. It is how well you use the infrastructure that you have. It's a complicated formula, but it takes into account how many trains you're running, the length of the line, how much it costs to build it, whether you're using it for train service frequently enough. The lower the number, the better. Numbers above 1 are not as efficient. Numbers below 1 are very efficient. Okay. Let's look at London to Manchester, 160 miles, 4 hour and 30 minute driving time versus 2 hour and 15 minute rail time. Train speed of 71, not setting the world on fire. 17 hour span, 45 trips. Half frequency add is only 10 minutes. These people don't even see it as an issue. So when they look at driving versus taking the train, it's a very easy decision. Notice the investment factor. You're down to 0.3. This means it takes extremely good use of the assets. Paris-Lyon, 233 miles. Again, driving time 4 hours and 30 minutes, rail time 2 hours. Train speed's up there, 116. This was one of the first high-speed lines built. Service span, 16 hours, 27 trips. Only a 15-minute frequency add. Investment factor of 0.8. That was an expensive line to build. Madrid to Barcelona, 335 miles. Driving time 6 hours. Rail time only 2 hours and 30 minutes. Very, very reasonable. Average train speed of blistering 133 miles an hour. 21 trips. The half frequency add is only 20 minutes. So pretty much you can just show up and go. It was an expensive line to build, so you've got an investment factor of 1.4. Berlin to Hamburg, 158 miles, 3 hours driving time. Notice it's getting a lot closer now. 3 hours driving time, 2 hours and 15 minute train time. Average train speed 70, span 16.5. Half frequency add is 20 minutes, so the perceived travel time is 2 hours 35 versus the drive time of 3 hours. So just a small advantage. Investment factor is great, 0.6. Zurich, Geneva, 153 miles, 3 hours and 20 minute driving time versus 2 hours and 45 minute train time. Average speed of only 56 miles an hour. The line does extremely well. Span of service, 16.5 hours, 23 trips. A nice 10-minute frequency add. So that means just about any time you show up at the train station, you can get a train. And you won't have to wait very long at all. So the perceived travel time is 2 hours and 55. Driving time is 3 hours and 20. So driving time is not much longer, yet these trains are full. Tokyo, Osaka. Now here's a big outlier. 299 miles. Driving time is awful, 6 hours versus 2 hours and 30 minutes. Average train speed 119. Same service span as all the rest. 62 trips. The frequency added is only 10 minutes. Perceived time of 2 hours and 40. And notice they paid off their system. It's an investment factor of 0.4. Now let's take a look at some of the U.S. rail corridors. Chicago, St. Louis, 284 miles, driving time 4 hours and 40 minutes, rail travel time 5 hours and 20 minutes. You see the problem. Now, the average speed, 53 miles an hour, does not compare that badly with a few of those ones in Europe. But it's the overall travel time that's an issue here. But there's a second problem. Span of service, 12 hours. That's much lower than most of the other systems. And only 5 trips. And this is what kills you. The frequency add is 70 minutes, an hour and 10 minutes. People are adding to the travel time of 5 hours and 20 minutes, meaning they're perceiving the travel time as 6.5 hours. That is very difficult to compete with a drive time of 4 hours and 40. The investment factor on the corridor to improve the corridor, if you continue to keep the trips to 5, is a whopping 5.2. You're putting a lot of money into a corridor to generate traffic, but you're not using it. Frequency here has to be a priority. Now, while getting the travel time down is important, and I believe the goal is 4 hours and 30 minutes, which would put it competitive with driving time on the improvements, it's the frequency that's still going to hurt, because it's going to add over an hour to the perceived travel time, even if we get it down to 4 hours and 30. Let's look at Chicago-Detroit. 281 miles. Again, driving time about 4 hours and 20 minutes. Rail travel time 5 hours and 15. Not too bad. Just about an hour over drive time. And with the improvements that are coming, should get us back down. I'm sure Tim will tell us a little bit more. A lot closer to that drive time. Average train speed right now is 54. If it could get up to 60 or so, we would probably have a very good competitive service. Here we have an even worse span of service, 10.5 hours. So there's very few options, only 3 trips. The half frequency add is 60 minutes, and that's only, it looks better than St. Louis only because the span of service is so short. So the work here is substantial. The number of frequency adds are really critical to making this work. Again, a very high investment factor because we're building a transportation corridor to serve people, but we're not putting enough frequency in it to make it pay off. Los Angeles, San Diego. Another one where we're awful close. 2 hours and 10 driving time, 2 hours and 45 on the train. The average speed could be improved, but the service span is good, 16 hours, 11 trips. The half frequency add is 45 minutes, a little longer than be comfortable with, and it bumps our travel time perception up to 3 hours and 30. But the investment factor is right on the line. We're putting the money in where it should be. The improvements that are coming up in the near future, I think, will improve this even more. It's a very good platform to build improvements on. Let's look at San Francisco, Oakland, going to Sacramento, the Capital Corridor. Gene will be talking, I'm sure, mentioning this from time to time. A much shorter distance, only 90 miles. The driving time is an hour and 30 when the freeway gods cooperate, which isn't always the case in that particular corridor. The rail travel time is 2 hours and 40. Average train speed 45, one of the lowest of the major corridors. But the span of service is high, 14.5. The trips are 11, which is fantastic. The frequency add is only 40 minutes, so it's not too bad. But it comes out at 3 hours and 20 on a perceptual basis versus driving of an hour and 30. So significant work needs to be done to try to get that corridor speed up in this case rather than the frequency. We have the frequency, we just need a little speed improvements to get that one to work. New York, Washington, 4 hour and 20 drive time, rail travel time at 2 hours and 45. That's why that corridor works so well. Average speed is 82 miles an hour, pretty good. 19-hour service span. That is incredible. It's one of the highest span of service of anybody. In fact, it could be argued that it's actually 24 hours. There are 2 trains in the middle of the night that traverse the corridor. So you could actually get a train at 3 in the morning. 31 trips, half frequency out of only 20 minutes, very comparable across the world. The perceived travel time at 3 hours and 5 is still less than driving time. And the investment factor at 0.7 shows we're getting a very good return on our investment. New York-Boston, the newer one, 231 miles. Same drive time, 4 hours and 40. Rail travel time about an hour less. Average speed, 63 miles an hour, good. 22 trips. So this is giving you a half frequency of only 20 minutes, which puts it in the world-class category. The travel time is perceived as 4 hours. The driving time at 4 hours and 40 is a little longer, but it certainly puts it in the range. It's a newer corridor, it was a little more expensive at 0.9, but a very good investment. Now, let's see what all this means when we put it all together. Take a look at the numbers up ahead. First off, let's look at the populations. London to Paris, 13 million, 12 million. London to Manchester, 13 million to 2.5 million. These are metropolitan statistical areas, not just the cities. Now, then take a look at Chicago, St. Louis, 10 million to 3 million. Very comparable with London, Manchester. Los Angeles, San Diego, 13 million to 3 million. Almost exactly the same as London, Manchester. Oakland, Sacramento, 8.5 million to 2 million. Very, actually beats Madrid, Barcelona. New York, Washington, 19 million to 6 million. Not quite the same as Tokyo, Osaka, but higher than most of the other corridors. So we definitely are in the running. We have very good corridors that make substantial sense for investment in rail transportation and short haul markets. Where we need to spend some time and do some work, Chicago, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, our homegrown corridors here. Obviously, there's a need to get the speeds up higher and reduce the travel time. And the important thing is it's been shown year after year after year in studies that as the travel time equals car travel time, that the amount of patronage rises substantially. It's not a linear function, it's an asymptotic function. It comes up much, much faster once you equal and then beat car travel time. Once you're above car travel time, you're very limited on patronage. There's a certain number of folks that just look at the raw numbers and say, I'm not going to do this, I can do it faster to drive. And so you can see where we need the effort. Interestingly, it's the perception, though, that can get us gains far beyond just the improvements. The civil engineering improvements to make trains run faster are substantial. There are many hundreds of millions of dollars put into the right of way. They involve a lot of environmental aspects. They involve working with communities to realign curves. Ann Arbor to Detroit has a whole series of curves along the river. It's very difficult to increase the speeds in those areas. But little by little, we've been knocking them down on a long-term program. But look at the gains we can get. If we increase the number of trains to 11 in these two corridors, St. Louis and Detroit, you drop the frequency add to just 30 minutes from 70 minutes. What that means is the perceptional is that you just cut a half hour out of your travel time. That's huge. That is a big advantage that you wouldn't have had simply because of the frequency, that somebody doesn't have to wait until the next time that train is available to operate. So there has to be a discussion when we're looking at our corridors of both the capital improvements for speed increases as well as increasing the frequency. And in many cases, when we run the numbers, the frequency increase is less expensive to do than the capital improvement. And so not only that, it's something I think you innately understand. The other thing is we have to look at is the span of service. Kind of best practices somewhere in the 15 to 16 hour range. When we're at 12 and 10, we really limit the travel times people have. there was an interesting study done way back in the 50s by the New York Central Railroad. And they thought, well, let's drop off those last 3 trains, just don't carry enough people. So we'll get rid of the 1:30, the 12:30, and the 11:30 trains. So they did. And what happened is their main route, their main passenger line went down substantially. And they thought, well, this doesn't make any sense. Those trains were hardly carrying anybody. Why did we lose patronage on the main commuting hours when we got rid of these off-hour trains? And so they started interviewing folks. And the answer they got was, I don't ride that train. In fact, I almost never do. But knowing it's there means whether I can go out to dinner or not. If I want to meet my wife downtown and go out to dinner, I don't want to be looking at my watch the whole time to make sure I make that last train. I want to know that there's enough other train service that I can still get home. And that was really a revelation. That was not understood in the industry prior to that. And there's a number of people that began to look at this phenomenon and found that it was true. Transit agency, ART, and others have all figured this out over time. Washington Metro is stewing with this problem because you have to balance it with the ability to maintain the track and infrastructure. But having those late night departures are really crucial in many cases to whether or not people can use the service. Let me give you an example of another thing on frequency. Let's say you took a 7 a.m. train down to St. Louis. Let's say we had it down to 4.5 hours. So you would get there around 11:30 in the morning.
That's fine.
You want to spend some time with a client. You go and talk to him, have lunch and whatnot. Things are going well. You go back to his office. You talk about how what your company can do for them, and so forth. You look at your watch, and it's 1:45. You realize the next train back to Chicago leaves at 2, and you're not going to make it. The next one after that is at 5:30. You now have a 3.5-hour wait for a 4.5-hour train trip. You recognize that it's going to take 8 hours from the point you're standing at to get back to Chicago. For most people, that's pretty much unacceptable. What they're going to do is go out to the airport and just grab the next flight. And I certainly understand that. That frequency difference makes a huge difference. The other interesting thing, and I think Gene Skorpowski talked to that as well, is that adding an additional train round trip does not increase the cost the same as the first 1 or 2. It's actually far less on a percentage basis for every train you add. First off, the crews that you're using aren't sitting around at the station. They're the same ones waiting 3.5 hours for the next return. They can take another train back immediately, so you get much better utilization of your crews. The same goes to equipment. A lot of times you can ferry the equipment, you can make 2 or 3 runs on the equipment instead of 1. So you haven't increased your equipment costs, you haven't increased your personnel costs. So you've got a lot of other fixed assets, the right-of-way, the signal system, the stations, all of that gets reused. So adding a frequency is really an incredibly valuable thing to do. We rediscovered that in the early days of Amtrak in Northern California when the San Joaquin service was originally instigated with a single round trip from the Bay Area down to Bakersfield. And the state was fielding complaints from people that with only 1 train, they couldn't do a full day's business or whatever. They couldn't see family, the schedule wasn't good, so the state proposed a second train. So they put money in the budget for a second train at the same level the first train was in. So they put on the second train, and what happened was they increased their patronage more than the first train, more than to cover the second train, and actually more than that. And because of that, they needed less subsidy, so they actually had money left over. And they thought about it for a while, and in good government fashion, instead of handing it back, they said, well, but if we added a third frequency? So they put a third frequency on. And lo and behold, it increased more again than what the first train did. And it continued as they added more and more trains on the corridor until they satiated the demand on the corridor. But looking again at not only the San Joaquin, the Bay Area to Sacramento line that was put in had not even operated in some 30 years when Amtrak did the installation and started the process, or Caltrans, to put the train in service. when they looked at that corridor, they thought that it had potential, and they started it with a reasonable frequency. But the frequency now on that corridor at 11 trains each way is much higher than anyone anticipated at the time, and yet it continues to grow. And I guess the bottom line message that we have here with this, I think Ed Ellis said it best. To make money, you have to have a service to get a significant market share, which means you need to catch people at all kinds of different points. It has nothing to do with high speed, it has to do with frequency. Thanks.
Are there any questions for Mark?
Yeah, I got one.
Okay.
Don't know if I need a microphone, I'll try to talk loudly. In Indiana, we have a train, a single train, runs about 3.5 times 2 days a week. The reason I say that, it runs 3 full days round trip and 2 single days one way only. It's a rather slow route. So is there a point, based on what you were saying earlier in your presentation, where you have to spend a certain amount of money to get the speed up enough where you can go more frequencies on that single piece of equipment? And generally speaking, what's the cost of doing so?
There's no rule of thumb that you can use to apply to any certain situation, particularly around Chicago, where many of the delays and the slow running are related to infrastructure that's a century old, and it has very significant limitations on improving curves and speeds and cross interlockings and whatnot.
I'm not sure your mic is on.
Oh, thank you. There. So, no, that was good. The basic thing is that there are 2 functions when you're looking at improving a route, is looking at both the improvement to the civil aspects of it, but importantly looking at the frequency aspects, because you can sometimes get a similar improvement, particularly if you're getting close on running time. If you're close to car travel time, if you can improve the frequency, you can improve the perception of the service to be faster than you might want it to be. But importantly, that allows people to cut out the waiting time that they otherwise would have had to entail, because they're focused on the arrival time. They're standing here today, and if somebody says you need to go to St. Louis, it's not the departure time I'm most interested in, it's the arrival time. And what do I have to do to get to that point? And if the next train isn't departing for 4 hours, I have plenty of time to sit here and talk. If the departures are hourly, I know I can show up at the station and pretty much leave. By the way, pretty much there is a rule of thumb in the world that short haul corridors need to operate on 1 hour frequencies, and longer corridors, generally over 300 miles, need to operate a minimum of 2 hour frequency. And that goes against many of the corridors that we have in the United States, but we're not operating at that frequency. And that's what drives some of those numbers to the positions they're at. And I don't want to say that you ignore civil speed improvements, because you need to have those as well, but I'm saying it's a good mix. Increase the frequency and do some of the civil and speed improvements, and you get the traffic you're looking for. Yes?
Mark, to kind of expand upon what you just talked about, could you please talk a little bit about the Chicago-Milwaukee Hiawatha corridor and the fact that it's probably never going to see the 100-mile-per-hour speeds, and should we be concerned about that?
Well, the Milwaukee corridor is a competitive corridor. It is a little longer than car driving time. Its frequency could definitely stand improvement. It's much better than it was when Amtrak started. It's a successful corridor. One of the things I didn't mention in there is that there are the other component, the punctuality, is oftentimes factored in by people based on the reputation of the line. We generally don't have stats when you go and book your train that says what the average on-time performance is, but a lot of times people who use corridors frequently get to know that. The Milwaukee corridor has extremely high reliability, as do a number of corridors in the Amtrak network. And because of that, that does not factor into it. Now, if the train is constantly a half hour, 15 minutes late, people put that in when they factor out whether to use it. I would say on the Milwaukee corridor, we actually operate fairly fast at 80. The fact that we're going over to PTC means the old barrier of 79 miles an hour really will drop by the wayside. I think some targeted improvements to take things up to 90 or 100 would be very reasonable, and at the same time look at increasing the frequency. Right now, if you talk to people that go to Milwaukee, there's a return train around 3, and the next one isn't until 5:30. And then that gets you back fairly late into Chicago. So, a middle departure somewhere around 4:15 or 4:30 would really be useful. There are other places in the schedule as well that I think it's important. And as advocates, I think we need to help target the state and tell them what's important, whether it's, obviously we'd like everything, we'd like speed increases and we'd like frequency, but kind of take a look at the situation and see which one would produce the better bang for the buck. Now, that's difficult sometimes on government-funded projects because capital money is easier to come by sometimes than operating money. And a frequency increase does require operating funds. If you all remember, I think the Midwest High-Speed Rail Association was instrumental in doing the doubling of frequency in many of the corridors in the Midwest a number of years ago. And it had a huge reaction by the public, which increased the riding on all those trains much more so than they had before. Yes?
Could you discuss one of another corridor you didn't mention, and that's the Chinese railroads, and specifically the between Shanghai and Beijing?
It's ironic you should say that. I had that in this presentation, but it is so long. It's over 1,000 miles. So it doesn't fit in with the other corridors here. And as I looked at it, and the drive time in China, it was like 20 hours or something like that. And I said, well, okay, we're not going to include this. It's not a real good connector. But Shanghai and Beijing, being two of the largest cities in China, are a major connection for us. As part of APTA and ARIMA, back in 2011, we did a visit out to Asia and looked at all of the different high-speed systems. And at the time, Shanghai to Beijing was an overnight train ride. And they were getting ready to cut over the high-speed rail corridor. And in the middle of the night, they switched us onto it. And we ended up arriving into Beijing like 2.5 hours early because of it. And they said that they were going to discontinue the sleeping car service because they were going to be down to like 6 hours on the train running at high speed. And they've since shifted the trains to Hong Kong to Beijing. They're in a league of their own. They have more miles of high-speed rail in Beijing than if you add up all the high-speed rail systems in the rest of the world. It is an incredible achievement, and they operate it day in, day out, and it has shrunk the country. It is the way people move around has gotten them the ability now to make all these far-flung provinces work as one. You may not agree with the political system they have there, but they did set a goal and follow through on it, and they're reaping the advantage of it.
I'm curious about the investment factor and the variables that are considered in calculating that.
It's messy. I was going to put it up there. I would be happy to spend some time talking with you on it. But the primary factors are the length of the line and how many trains are operated on it, and the cost to build and improve the line. Yes?
My question is an obvious one for many of us in the room, and that's that big elephant in the Twin Cities, Chicago. And it's been in planning for 10 years. And while I favor environmental rules and regulations, I don't see why they have to keep doing environmental reports. I mean, the CP adds and takes off grain trains on a daily basis without telling anybody. Why can't a extra passenger train be added without years of study?
I won't comment on the NEPA rules. They are frustrating. There are things that are done. For example, the Chicago-Milwaukee corridor increased the number of trains on it. Recently went through a full environmental impact statement. It's taken them years and years to develop it and answer all the questions and respond to the communities. NEPA is not as much about environmental as you would think. It's actually a planning tool and structures the way you do capital improvements where there's federal government money involved. Some people think it just has to do with bugs and bunnies and things, and it doesn't. It looks at what the changes will mean to the community and coming up with a comprehensive list of all the things that could happen, none of which stops you from doing the job. At some point, somebody has to make an apples to oranges comparison and say, having better train service is worth these impacts. In other cases, they may look at it and say it's not. There's the whole process, I believe, takes longer than it should, but it is a complex process that in the end should lead you to making a good decision. And we hope that in cases like Chicago, Minneapolis, and Chicago-Milwaukee, that good decisions come out of all this. I think we're all frustrated. Minneapolis in particular is, I think, slowed down by the governor's concern over train operations and funding them over a long term. And Wisconsin is the only way to get to Minneapolis with any reasonable speed. And so we're kind of limited on what we can do there. That's why advocacy situations like this are so important. Yes?
With regard to the perception of travel time,
Yeah.
has there been any study done relative to the fact that on the train you can often use the time effectively, so the actual investment in travel time is reduced by the time that you can use productively elsewhere? And if there has been, is there an additional need for messaging around the fact that your investment in travel time is offset by that productive time on the train?
That has been indicated in many studies. A good friend of mine, John Bottom over at Steer Davies Gleave in Boston, does ridership analyses, and they include the productive time in the calculation. And most people know when you go to the airport, you've got limited segments of time where you can concentrate and work on something. You've got a little time sitting around at the boarding lounge, you've got a little bit of time in flight, but there's times when you can't have your equipment out, you can't spread things around if you can even move. So it limits what you can do, and that's why even though train travel in some cases may be longer, that the access ability and other things come into play. You'll see in Europe, if you talk to German businessmen in Europe, the fascinating thing is they all know off the top of their head which is the best way to get somewhere. If you're in Munich and you say, oh yeah, the meeting's in Stuttgart, the train leaves at 15 minutes after the hour, it takes 2.5 hours, and whatnot. If you're going here, if you're going there, they have them all memorized. They say Vienna, they say, oh, well then you have to fly, the flights are at this, this, and this. And it's not substantially longer, but it's not particularly productive, and that's why they know where those dividing lines are. Americans not so much yet, but they do on the Northeast Corridor. A lot of people on the Northeast Corridor know exactly where that dividing line is and what they want to do on the trip that gives them that time. So it is factored into these considerations, which is why I'm saying we don't have to hit automobile driving time. You're exactly right. We just have to get it a little closer so that it doesn't become such a factor in the decision. One more.
Regarding driving time, it sounds to me like, I'm not sure if they're factoring in traffic congestion, wear and tear on your car crashes on the expressway, the danger of serious injury, drunk drivers on the roads. You don't have any of that on trains.
You're absolutely right. What it's used for is a benchmark on acceptable travel time. And that's all people use it for. In the back of their minds, they know that they can hit there's a better chance of congestion. There's a better chance that they may be delayed by factors outside their control. that the cost of their car is substantial. And by the way, just to give you a good example of where people are misled by that, anybody here use Uber? Time to time? Yeah, that's a pretty good sized group. All right. The drivers in Uber get a payment for every trip they take. And a number of folks have calculated what that payment is. And that's obviously to cover two things: their labor and their cost to maintain their car. They have to put fuel and oil in it, repair it, and replace it at certain points. And people have applied the standard IRS rate, which is around 53 cents a mile or so, to Uber trips, and then compared what they get out of it. And in some cases, they've calculated that the drivers are earning less than $1 an hour. And what that tells you is they don't recognize that they're depreciating their car as much as they are. And drivers who use trips to go, say, to St. Louis and back, that have just added 700 miles to their car, don't really see it that way. They see it as the cost of the gas, but they don't really perceive it as all the other factors that are included in there. So it's one of the difficulties we have, because payment on a rail system requires you to pay it up front. On an automobile, you could put it off for a few years. You may have to replace the car a year earlier than you thought. You may have to get a transmission repaired a year out. You don't really connect it to the trip. But if you think about it, if that particular car fails at one point, you're only driving 700, that extra 700 miles may have been you could have lasted 3 or 4, 5 more months before you had to replace it. It's one of the things that we sometimes have to get across to folks is the real cost of what it takes to drive there and back. But I do want to emphasize that driving number is just a benchmark, because the reality is access time is much different. Cars have infinite frequency. You still have to leave the city or wherever you're at and get onto a mainline road before you can go where you're going. At the same time, you do have to spend some time to get to the train station. You do have to find a place to park, or take an Uber, or take a taxi, or take public transportation, or whatever access mode allows you to get to the station. But there is time to do that you have to factor in. There's time, frequency, waiting for the service, and then the actual running time of the service. But all in all, we are in a very good position to show ourselves to the general public on what our network can do and what it can do for people. And one of the things I'm most heartened by is the current generation, millennials and the sub-millennials, or whatever they're going to call themselves, recognize this immediately, and they see the advantages of it. And so with that, I think we're on the right side of history, and I think we should continue on to do what we've been doing. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.